Welcome back, everyone. In this lecture, we are going to explore what life is like in prison for inmates who are serving long sentences that we have discussed in previous lectures. We are going to look at the inmate code, how individuals interact with each other based on race and sexuality. We are also going to look at how those interactions affect the safety and possible victimizations within the prison itself. Finally, we are going to discuss inmate rights and how those constitutional protections extend to the prison environment. That's a lot to discuss, so we better get started. To begin, we have to think of prison as an all-encompassing experience. For the duration of the inmate's incarceration sentence, he or she will live, eat, sleep, and work with the same individuals day in and day out. They will see each other at their lowest lows, see each other struggle to hold on to hope, and also strive to make a life for themselves in this new environment. This thought process is derived from the idea that prison is a total institution. Individuals are cut off from the outside world, with the exception of visitation from loved ones or possible work details if certain inmates are lucky enough to receive something like that, which allows them outside the walls of the prison. But for the most part, individuals are segregated away from the world that they once knew. Since inmates are removed from their previous lives, they become dependent on those that they live and work with. Like any other relationship, there are expectations in terms of behavior and interactions with one another, and interactions between the correctional officers and inmates. Inmates must look out for one another and view the correctional officers as the enemy. This pattern of behavior is known as the convict code, and inmates must uphold the convict code at all times. The convict code reinforces the us versus them mentality between the inmates and the correctional officers. Correctional officers are not to be trusted, and some inmates are not to be trusted either. It is not very difficult to determine which inmates are working as snitches for the correctional officers. Snitching places inmates in a dangerous position and often requires protective custody measures to keep them safe. Even though inmates are safer in protective custody, it makes them easily identifiable by other inmates as snitches. Because prison is an all-encompassing experience, inmates often alter their behavior based on the situations that they encounter while they are incarcerated. This alteration in behavior can be explained through two methods. The first method that we will discuss is the deprivation model. When an inmate enters prison for the first time, the inmate experiences prisonization. Prisonization is the process by which an inmate becomes socialized into the customs and principles of inmate society. The longer inmates stay in prison, the more prisonized they become, and the more likely that they will return to crime after their release. This is because they do not know how to function without the limitations and control that prison provides them. The second method of explanation is the importation model. Inmates who were thieves and persistently associated with other thieves before going to prison bring the norms and values of thieves into prison. Generally, law-abiding people will be more likely to be loyal to staff norms while in prison rather than the convict code. So basically, who I was on the outside, according to the importation model, will influence my behavior while I'm on the inside. Part of the behavioral adjustment has to do with the inmate's ability to stay safe and not be victimized by the other inmates. Even though correctional officers have the duty to keep the inmates safe, there are still areas within the prison that inmates are able to avoid surveillance and allow themselves to victimize one another. Prisons are very violent places and altercations occur quite frequently. Victimization and violence are often the result of racial tensions, gang affiliation, overcrowding, and often involve young, hot-tempered inmates who still have something to prove within the prison structure. Older inmates have already earned their respect and are less likely to be violent. However, they can still be violent if the situation calls for it. Violence can occur between only a few inmates, or it can be directed towards staff. When there are more inmates involved, there is a better chance of a riot occurring. Riots typically occur in reaction to poor prison conditions, low-quality food, or a systemic history of correctional officers who abuse their power. Even though physical victimization is scary and can be very harmful to those involved, It is not the only or even the most frequent type of victimization that occurs within a prison. Other kinds of victimization include economic, psychological, social, or emotional types. Being able to victimize another inmate is often thought of as one proving his power or respect to the perpetrator and shows that he or she should not be messed with. These may be perpetrated by inmates, by staff, or by both. Psychological victimization consists of subtle manipulation tactics and mind games that occur frequently within the prison. Staff members will threaten to expose information from an inmate's file. Inmates can threaten to tell superiors about staff correction or failure to follow procedure. There is a thin line in prison about who could be the victim of violence or other types of abuse at any given time. That's why many emphasize the importance of being assertive when you arrive to prison for the first time, in order to limit the frequency and occurrence of victimizations to your person. A good deal of prison violence, but not all, has sexual overtones. This is one of the most prevalent ways for men to assert their dominance over other men within the prison. Sexual abuse is not something that stays very silent either. The victim might not be quick to advertise the victimization himself, or that it has occurred, but the perpetrator will often brag about making another inmate their bitch. Sex is an interesting issue within prisons. Heterosexual relationships are denied to inmates through the sheer process of incarceration, unless you are in a state that allows conjugal visits. With the absence of an inmate's preferred sexual outlet, many turn to what is called, quote, gay for the stay. But that does not mean that all instances of sex in prison are violent or even abusive, nor does it mean that all instances of sex in prison are homosexual. Sexual encounters can involve both inmates and staff, even though it is a forbidden practice. Contraband materials are highly coveted in prisons. Inmates will do almost anything to get some of these items, and that makes them all the more valuable. Even though prison is supposed to be isolated from the outside world, it is possible to get almost anything that you need within prison. For example, drugs of any variety can be smuggled in either by correctional officers, by visitors, or even through the mail. Not every smuggling attempt is successful, but people still try it all the time. Outsiders will try to smuggle in cell phones inside other things, such as a cutout book or a cutout pack of trading cards, to try and disguise the phone, as is shown in the picture on your screen. Having a cell phone allows inmates to plan out crimes on the outside without the prison being ever aware that these plans occur. However, correctional officers know how smuggling and contraband items get into the prison. So sending a cell phone and a cutout pack of cards is not necessarily the most clever of plans, but cell phones do indeed get into prisons. The sub rosa economy sets the stage for various kinds of economic victimization, including theft, robbery, fraud, extortion, and even loan sharking. As we discussed before, prison is all about survival and trying to thrive given the environment that you find yourself in. In other words, it's all about coping. There are two broad ways in which inmates cope with imprisonment. The first is entering the public domain. In this instance, the inmates in the prison's public domain are predatory and violent and seek power and status by dominating and victimizing others. These are the inmates who are always looking for respect and can use violence and intimidation in order to achieve that respect. Secondly, we have inmates who enter the private culture. Most inmates actually enter the prison's private culture rather than the public domain. These inmates find in the diverse environment of the institution a niche which will accommodate their needs, such as a job in the library to accommodate a person's need for privacy and safety. Inmates usually develop a prison lifestyle that will help them make the most of their time while they're in prison. There's 3 different styles that an inmate can adapt. The first one is the idea that they are doing time. This means that they are getting out as soon as possible and they are trying to avoid extra punishment and avoid hard time. This means that inmates will keep their noses clean and they will keep to themselves in order to avoid getting into any confrontations that may lead to punishment. They will also do the work that is assigned to them and nothing more. They're not getting involved in any confrontations. They're just keeping to themselves. In the second category, we see that inmates are jailing. In this category, inmates achieve positions of influence within the inmate society. These inmates are often involved in disputes and confrontations. They are trying to gain status within the prison structure and feel the need to be respected by other inmates. This is an excellent example about inmates who enter the public domain, as we just discussed. Finally, you have inmates who are trying to glean. This means that they are trying to take advantage of the resources that are available to them for their own personal betterment. For example, inmates who are gleaning are trying to get clean and sober through alcohol and drug treatment. They're taking advantage of the educational opportunities available to them, and they might even be very active in the prison's religious community. Next, I want to switch gears for a minute and talk about women in prison. Your textbook doesn't actually have a chapter that is devoted to women at all. I think this is a disservice to you because women are so much different than men in the types of crimes that they commit and what life in prison is like for them. However, if you take the corrections class, you'll probably have more of an opportunity and more exposure to women who are currently incarcerated. Women are not not violent in the same way that men are. Instead, women have a lot more emotional interaction and confrontation with one another. Female inmates are more likely to have children and are more likely to have been living with those children immediately before incarceration compared to men. In some cases, very young children may even live with their mothers in prison for a temporary period. This normally occurs if the mother goes into the prison while she's pregnant. Some women may lose custody of their children depending on the crime that they have committed and the duration of their prison sentence. Often children live with other relatives and have little or no visitation with the mother while she is incarcerated. Women in prison normally form friendships and families within the prison structure. There are also more opportunities for women to learn a trade comparative to those available in men's prisons. Women get training from the institution and from other female inmates in trades such as cosmetology. Because women are generally more emotional in their dealings than men are, we see the creation of more of a family-style structure than anything that would ever take place in a men's prison. There are often mother-daughter roles adapted by the women, and they serve each other in this dynamic when there are no suitable role models present for the other women. Women also engage in homosexual sexual relationships and are also, quote, gay for this day, just like some men are. But the women who are in these relationships more often are in heterosexual relationships with a male partner on the outside. The female companionship that they seek in prison is a way to fill the void left by the outside relationship that they are currently missing. There are also 3 roles that women can commonly adapt when they are adjusting to prison life. The first is the square. These are the women who are primarily non-criminals before imprisonment and tend towards conventional behavior while they are in prison. The second is the idea of the lifer. These are the habitual offenders who continue to display antisocial and anti-authority behavior during their incarceration sentences. And finally, the last typology that a woman can adapt is the idea of the cool typology. This is the sophisticated professional criminal who tries to do easy time by either manipulating other inmates or by manipulating the staff to do their own advantage and to take advantage of their roles. For the remainder of the lecture, I would like to focus on inmates' rights from a legal perspective. So for a good chunk of time, what we saw was that the government was not interfering with the way that prisons were run. They figured that that was the prison's business, and who are we to tell them what to do? But by doing so and keeping this hands-off approach, the court essentially allowed for abuses to run rampant, and finally the court had to step back in order to stop these civil rights violations and to stop civil rights from being disregarded altogether. There was basically a total reversal in how the court saw inmates. They state that inmates still have the same rights as everyone else, just there are certain limitations to those protections while in prison. But inmates are able to access courts because we are discussing their life and their liberty, things that need protections. The legal doctrine that grants correctional clients access to the courts to challenge the legality of their sentence is known as habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is mentioned in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, where it states, quote, "The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when, in cases of rebellion or invasion and public safety may require it." The writ of habeas corpus is also known as the Great Writ of Liberty. Habeas corpus is an order for correctional authorities, known as the respondent in the case, to bring the defendant, known as the petitioner, to court. There are really three main purposes of habeas corpus for the inmates. First, it is to provide them release from their illegal confinement. Habeas corpus can also order the prisoner to court for prosecution. And finally, habeas corpus allows for the prisoner to be ordered before the court to give evidence in his or her own case. Inmates pursue habeas corpus filings for several reasons. The most common reason the inmates cite for the illegality of their sentence stems from ineffective defense counsel. Other commonly cited reasons include error by the trial court, due process concerns, and self-incrimination or Fifth Amendment violations that resulted in their sentence perceived to be illegal. To get their cases to court, prisoners need access to legal materials, and many of them need legal assistance from persons who are skilled in law. The United States Supreme Court has held that jailhouse lawyers must be permitted to assist other inmates, and that inmates are entitled to either an adequate law library or adequate legal assistance. Even though inmates should have access to the courts, the system has become overwhelmed over the years by the number of petitions that were being filed by inmates. In response, the government passed legislation that limited the number of petitions that each individual could file per year. This was in an attempt to stop the inmates from filing civil rights cases over frivolous items like the type or quality of toilet paper that was used in the facility, or the amount of yard time that inmates received each day. Restrictions on freedom of religion may be imposed where prison officials can demonstrate convincingly that religious practices compromise security or are unreasonably restrictive. There is a balancing test when it comes to religion. The jurist must outweigh the importance of multiple factors in a legal case. There has to be a deeper consideration of issues than just the baseline grievance. This requires that you must balance the constitutional rights of the inmate against what is best for the prison as an institution when taking safety risk into concern. This ruling comes from a statute that was instituted by the California Department of Corrections, which prohibited inmates from talking to the press and forbade them from giving media interviews. The California Department of Corrections manual provides that, quote, press and other media interviews with specific individual inmates will not be permitted. This interference stated that this was based on the fact that they had allowed interviews in the past, and those interviews ended up badly for the prison. So the Department of Correction ruled that there would be no more interviews. Some of the interviews that were taking place gave the inmates too much notoriety both inside and outside of the prison. This created a safety issue. The inmates then filed suit saying that their First Amendment rights were being infringed upon. The Supreme Court said no, that they were not. The prison has a legitimate reason for not allowing the inmates to talk to the media. They didn't want the prisoners to gain too much notoriety, for the prison to have a bad image, and also to keep everyone safe. Religion is also protected under your First Amendment rights. Religion within a prison is also protected, but there has to be some standards set up. So in order for inmates to be able to practice their chosen religion, the court has recognized that 3 elements must be met. First, that the religion in question has to be an established religion. Normally, the court will judge based on whether or not individuals practice this religion outside of the prison as well. 2, that the practices must conform to the tenets of the religion. So for example, if you have declared yourself Christian or Muslim, then you would probably not be allowed to take part in Passover services that are reserved exclusively for Jewish inmates. And 3, that the religion must not be a security risk. Nothing that you do in trying to practice your religion can serve as a security risk or disrupt the normal prison operations. For example, you might not get to light a menorah because there is the threat that you could try to set something else on fire. This might be especially true in a non-smoking prison where you normally would not have access to matches or to a lighter. Just because a religion provides perhaps a better meal that is perceived by the inmates, or because the inmates don't have to work on Passover, inmates are not allowed to switch religions based on what is available to them at that time. This means that once you declare yourself as a member of a particular religion, you have to celebrate that religion and you cannot change your mind later. Eighth Amendment protections make sure that we are not subjected to cruel and unusual punishments, among other things. But this does not necessarily only extend to the method and length of punishment. It also makes sure that inmates have adequate medical care. In 1976, the Supreme Court decided in Estelle v. Gamble and ruled that inmates have a right to adequate medical care. However, inmates claiming Eighth Amendment violations on medical grounds must demonstrate that prison officials have shown deliberate indifference to serious medical problems. The Eighth Amendment also protects against staff brutality. Staff brutality is normally considered a tort rather than a constitutional issue. However, whipping and other related forms of corporal punishment have been prohibited under the Eighth Amendment. The Supreme Court also found that staff who use too much force against an inmate need not cause a significant physical injury in order to violate the amendment protections. And finally, the Eighth Amendment protects against total prison conditions that are too far down in standards. The totality of conditions cases involve claims that some combination of prison practices and conditions make the prison as a whole unconstitutional. In the case of Holt v. Sarver in 1971, the entire Arkansas state prison system was declared unconstitutional on the grounds of the totality of conditions and was ordered to implement a variety of changes. Prisons have long had the right to provide only the minimal conditions necessary to human survival. This includes basic food, shelter, clothing, and medical care to sustain life. Finally, we have to discuss the limitations of litigation. Court litigation is an expensive way to reform prisons. It is also very slow and often piecemeal. Transformation of prison systems can be chaotic and unstable at times. This means that reforms may take many years to see success. Successful cases usually have limited impact. Even though the effects might take a while to see, inmates don't have any other option but to petition the courts to address their grievances. They are stuck in an environment where they are not trusted and they are often not listened to. This is their opportunity to try and get things changed for themselves and others. Although this was just a short look at what life is like in prison, this chapter does provide good context for what inmates must deal with on a daily basis. Prison is a violent place where abuses can come from inmates and correctional officers alike. Survival is key by any means necessary. We have seen what prison looks like and we know why it occurs. We also looked very briefly at women in prison and the differences that they encounter comparative to men. Finally, we looked at some of the legal protections that are afforded to inmates. You will learn more about these safeguards in criminal law, criminal procedure, and corrections classes. At this time, please consult your syllabus to make sure that you are up to date on all requirements for the class. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day.